Here we are. Took us 3-4 months, but we're where we thought we would be. What was the most likely scenario, where we thought this would probably end, as we saw the Trump administration engage in what I would say is pretty weak diplomatic effort. The reason I would call it pretty weak diplomatic effort is it felt like the Trump administration, the entire time they were trying to assert dominance, peace through strength, to get people to the negotiating table, they were asserting all of the tools in their tool belt for one side and not the other. And even that's not the case. It felt like the tools that were being used for one side and the other side were just completely mismatched, as if one person had one tool belt for one nation and another tool belt for another nation, if they were putting those tools out on loan. When he was dealing with the Ukrainians, all the strategy I have seen has been either hard pressure, hard diplomatic pressure, or just straight up cuts, i.e. cutting off intelligence support, cutting off aid, cutting off support to the Yale studies and the Yale projects to help return the kidnapped children. The open diplomatic PR effort to isolate Zelensky by calling him a dictator and by trying to say that he started the war, even if that's something that Trump has publicly tried to walk back on as of recent. Semi-walk back on, that is. Or, of course, that famous Oval Office meeting, which ended in disaster, both for the minerals deal, which has continued to be kicked down the road, and for the relationship between Kiev and Washington. And of course, it was that which helped which started the cutoff in aid and intelligence, which preceded the withdrawal from Kursk. In this tool belt that's being used against the Ukrainians, it seems like a lot of stick and not a lot of carrot. At no point have we seen any effort to, this is how we're going to continue to get more weapons support for you, to get more leverage in negotiations. Here is an avenue for you to get some aid and support right away if you take A, B, or C step. It's been a lot of stick and not a lot of carrot. I mean, the only area of diplomacy outside of this worth mentioning isn't an effort to give them a more carrot or an effort to give them more support, but is to bleed them dry through the mineral deal to settle past debts that Ukraine was not told when they were accruing them even were debts. Our military aid that we've given them up to this point, that the United States government has asserted in multiple occasions and many, many hearings, is within its own interests, not some charity effort. So it seems that a lot of hammer, if we're using the tool belt analogy for the Ukrainian side, which is not necessarily great, especially if the hammer's leaving bruises and they're supposed to be your champion. And then you go over to the other side, you go over to the Russians, and there's not really a lot of hammer. I mean, I guess if we're using a tool belt analogy, you've brought a six-pack, you left the tool belt at home. I mean, we've seen concessions on NATO membership, which of course was a crucial component of this war ever since the beginning. We've seen concessions on American military troops in Ukraine acting as a hard deterrent against future invasions. We've seen diplomatic concessions where the United States had steadfastly said that Ukraine would have to be at the negotiating table when these negotiations would occur. And they just completely throw that out of the window, both for the one-on-one normalization negotiations that the American administration started to engage in with the Trump administration, but also conversations regarding the war, to a point that even surprised the Saudis, who were acting as an intermediary, wanted the Ukrainians to be there, and it was the Trump administration boxing them out, to the confusions of the Saudi royal prince. And I mean, these are just a few of the concessions. There's other concessions as well. Of course, any pressure on the Ukrainians is seen as a concession by the Russians, especially the cuts in intelligence support and military aid. And not to mention any of the diplomatic PR coups that have been achieved in this time. Steve Witkoff talking about the referendums in occupied territory as if they were legitimate, and that's Trump's top negotiator on the issue. And that's just one matter. Steve Witkoff sounds like a Russian Today's 24/7 segment anytime I tune into anything he's associated with, really, on the matter, whether it's a podcast, some sort of press hearing, him on social media, him getting interviewed in a flyby interview. It seems anytime he talks about the man or he's saying something that you would expect to hear out on Solonyov live, not, out off of one of the primo negotiators put forward by the president of the United States. Not to mention the unending love and trust that Steve Witkoff has indicated Trump and Putin have through the paintings that have been exchanged and the prayers for each other's well-being, or Trump's personal statements of his trust for the dictator. The dictator who has violated his promises on not invading Ukraine many times again, but this time, Trump can trust him. Even though right now, they're at their wits' end to pull out their hair because it seems some party does not want peace. Now, here is how this would traditionally work, right? You're having a failing negotiation strategy. It's not working, you know? You haven't made any progress in the 3 to 4 months that you've tried this way. In fact, in that time, just more bodies have stacked, and you've had some pretty high casualty civilian events that have made your government look bad. The strike in Kiev and Ree, my God, oh, those dead children on the playground. Or the strikes in Sumy. That one was a double tap. I remember when I was in Sumy, I was there filming a documentary about what was going on in the border regions, and I was interviewing mayors and such. I was there for when the Russians bombed the nursing home, and they had to drag the elderly out and wrap them in tinfoil and package them before being loaded into the ambulances. Point is that those types of images don't make good frills for peace negotiation. So obviously something has to change. Something in this strategy has to change. You can't just keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And so we look to the Trump administration, and this is the message we're getting from them as these failures are starting to be publicly acknowledged. Listen to Donald Trump.
If for some reason one of the two parties makes it very difficult, we're just going to say you're foolish, you're fools, you're horrible people, and we're going to just take a pass. But hopefully we won't have to do that. No, Marco is right in saying it. We want to see it end.
And this is the problem right here. If one of the two sides, if either side's showing too many issues, Trump has to be willing to name the problem child. If you don't name the problem, you can't address the problem. And Ukraine has agreed to all of the limited ceasefires. They've agreed to the unlimited, unconditional ceasefire. They continue to make progress on the mineral negotiations. In fact, we actually have progress on that to be announced today, as there was a preliminary agreement that was signed by the Trump administration and the Kiev government on moving forward with the reconstruction mineral program. Here it is right now from the Ukrainian government. We are happy to announce the signing with our American partners of a memorandum of intent, which paves the way for the economic partnership agreement and the establishment of the investment fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine. While the Ukrainians haven't agreed to what Trump originally put forward with all of its bells and whistles without negotiation like he wanted, let's also acknowledge that that deal would have meant that Ukraine could not join the European Union because it would have dictated where certain exports went, which would not be in line with EU policy, and that is something the Ukrainians would not be willing to accept. But they continue to engage in negotiations, despite the fact that the proposals that were being put forward would stop them from joining the European Union, one of the big things that led to all of this bloodshed in the first place. So going back to Ukraine and then putting more stick on the table, cutting off aid again, which is already still at this point just trickling in because nothing else has been approved, cutting off intelligence support again. Going to those Yale researchers and, I don't know, disappearing them in a van. I don't even know what more stick the Trump administration could pull out at this point, besides threatening the Ukrainians with sanctions removal for the Russians, which would just be compounding the very mistake Trump has continuously made during the entirety of that process. And that's not bringing the full tool belt over to the Russian side. And that means pulling the trigger on what Trump said he was willing to do since day one and that he threatened to do on the campaign trail. And this was his promise. And the promise was that if the Russians were not willing to play ball with him, then he would go out there and he would send Ukraine even more aid, more than what they were getting before, so much aid to make it unbearable for the Russians. And after doing that, double down on the sanctions, therefore putting the Russians in a position where they cannot sustain themselves, and before bleeding out, they would accept some deal. This is the idea, or at least the general philosophy of what he put forward on the campaign trail. And on the first day of getting in there, he talked about sanctions policy on the Russians. He's never pulled a trigger on any sanction policy in relation to the Russians since entering into office. He pulled the trigger on cutting off aid to the Ukrainians, the same Ukrainians that agreed to the unilateral ceasefire when the Russians did not. Same thing with intelligence. So at what point does he say, okay, the carrot has not worked. We need to make the Russians think we're serious, because the Russians don't think they're serious. This is essentially what I think the Russians are betting on. Here is my speculation. My speculation is that the Russians hear Donald Trump and all of his cronies talking about how Ukraine has taken $350 billion from the United States. Now, that's a lie. It isn't true. But it's something that has been repeated in so many different ways and so many different forms to the American people, that them being told that it's actually like 1/3 that amount, and a significant amount of the aid that was approved was actually reinvested in the United States. And if future aid packages aren't delivered, then how is that aid to Ukraine? That's just, expansion for American defense companies getting, all that nuance is lost. All that nuance is boring. And so Trump talked about how much was being wasted, and he wants to deliver something to his base. And he also has other defense priorities with people like I believe his name is Colbridge Elby, or Colby Elbich, I forget whichever his name is. There's different staffers, but there's people like him, J.D. Vance, and others who believe that the White House should be pivoting towards Asia, not concentrating on this region, and that they don't have the resources to spend on it. Not to mention, of course, some of the personal feuding. So they believe that the White House is not willing to put down more aid. Hell, if they were willing to put down more aid, why haven't they put down more aid already? So their bet could just be, Trump won't put anything else on the table. We're willing to keep bouldering forward. Without America's support, Ukraine won't be able to last long. And even if they are, we'll at least be able to get a much better deal once the Americans have been scattered away, blown away, or have just sat back and done nothing for months, meaning less aid for the Ukrainians. Basically, the Russians are calling Trump's bluff, is the long and short of it, to take away all the diplomatic, all the diplomatic speak. And it is Trump's job to deliver the message that they should not have called his bluff. But that means pulling the trigger, and it also means them blaming the Russians for the reason that this fell apart. And as long as Trump is using language like this, that is not the message that he is delivering to the American people. As long as J.D. Vance continues to talk the way that he does, that is not the message that is being delivered to the American people either. And if that's not the message that's being delivered to the American people, I also don't think that is the message that Trump is trying to deliver to the world right now. But that's Donald Trump. That's not necessarily everybody else in his administration. Not our war. U.S. may drop Russia-Ukraine ceasefire effort unless progress is made, Rubio says. Now, this, of course, is the big headline. The fact that the Trump administration has gotten so fed up with all of these failures that they're willing to say, that's it. We've got a few more days, and if we don't see any progress, then we're going to wipe our hands of this failure of a negotiation process. Now, again, This would be the formal recognition of failure stacked upon all of the previous failures of this process. This would be the Trump administration essentially throwing in the towel on the negotiation process, which always was the most likely outcome. But the question is, what happens after this? Will they blame Russia for its failures? And will they say, okay, so we have to re-engage to put an end to it ourselves by backing up Ukraine, or wipe their hand of the matter entirely? And if they do wipe their hands of the matter, how will they wipe their hands? And I know that's a weird way to put it, but will they wipe their hands by just stepping back and seeing what happens? Or will they wipe their hands by removing sanctions on the Russians? Those types of things matter. And as of right now, considering how much Trump has flip-flopped around and how blame has somehow always found its way to reorient itself until it's back at the feet of the Ukrainians, even as the Ukrainians offer to pay for future weapon shipments, deliver, I mean, what you would think would be the holy grail of what somebody of Trump's populist America should get paid ethos would want, to deliver a victory to his people, especially at this point in his presidency, but it has not been accepted. The U.S. will cease its attempts to negotiate a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia in the following days if there's no signal that an agreement is reachable, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on April 18th, speaking after meeting European and Ukrainian officials in Paris. And there was also a phone call with Lavrov, Putin's foreign minister. Rubio said that U.S. President Donald Trump is interested in reaching a deal, but has other priorities as well. Trump began his presidency by pledging to broker a ceasefire within 24 hours, eventually extending this deadline to 100 days. He promised before he got inaugurated while debating Biden. These efforts have largely stalled, as Russia continues to reject a full-day, 30-day backed by Washington and Kiev, and a partial truce on strikes against energy facilities has failed to hold. We're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end, so we need to determine very quickly, and I'm talking a matter of days, of whether or not this is doable. I wanted to listen to Marco Rubio saying it himself instead of me just retelling it, so you guys can hear the seriousness at which Marco Rubio is talking about this. So at least I do think that this is his perspective. Whether or not this will be reverberated through the rest of the administration, I'm still not entirely sure. I'm, for example, curious about J.D. Vance.
So we came here yesterday to sort of begin to talk about more specific outlines of what it might take to end the war, to try to figure out very soon, and I'm talking about a matter of days, not a matter of weeks, whether or not this is the war that can be ended. If it can, we're prepared to do whatever we can to facilitate that and make sure that it happens, that it ends in a durable and just way. If it's not possible, if we're so far apart that this is not going to happen, then I think the president's probably at a point where he's going to say, well, we're done. You know, we'll do what we can on the margins. We'll be ready to help whenever you're ready to have peace. But we're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end. So we need to determine very quickly now, and I'm talking about in a matter of days, whether or not this is doable over the next few weeks. If it is, we're in. If it's not, then we have other priorities to focus on as
well. Now, when they say this, when they say, we have other priorities, is the signal being sent that we have other priorities than continuing this terrible negotiation, therefore we'll go back to what we were doing before and continue to support Ukraine? Or is it read of, again, we'll wipe our hands of the situation? Because if the message that they're intending to send is we'll give up on the negotiation and go back to the board of trying to increase Ukraine's leverage, I don't know if that's the message Marco Rubio is sending, when he also in these same press briefings says things like, this war has no military solution to it. I know that's Trump's line, but even if you don't think there's a military solution, but also the diplomatic solution has been closed to you, then you need to either open a diplomatic solution through military solutions, i.e. increasing Ukraine's leverage, or find a military solution. I wanted to also read this message from the DOS, the Department of State spokesperson, about how they would determine who's at fault for the failure of the ceasefire, or like how serious people are about an effort to find peace. When asked about the metrics of how the U.S. would look at determining Moscow's seriousness, a Department of State spokesperson said the judgment would be based on their actions, not their words. We have seen the actions that our friends, the Ukrainians, have taken, which is commitment to a full ceasefire. That has been clear from the start, and it's understandable. If this is the position of the Trump administration, then it's going to be impossible to balance it being Ukraine's fault with the fact that they accepted a full ceasefire. But the facts of the matter have never necessarily been a barrier for Trump or his cronies in dealing with our allies, i.e., the 350 billion lie, i.e., the thousands of troops encircled around Kursk, i.e., trusting Russian intelligence over American intelligence officials. Point is, whether or not Ukraine has committed itself to a full ceasefire, I don't necessarily think that equals, hey, Ukraine is Ukraine has been the one that's played ball here in Trump's mind, or that that's how he's going to treat them. I'm trying to think of the pathways Trump has, because I'm trying to think what would be if Trump takes the pathway of wiping his hands of the situation entirely. It will be a political disaster for him. He will be fulfilling a promise to a certain base of his party, the people who are the isolationists. We have seen recent polling that shows that roughly 46% of the Republican Party wants the United States to retract from world affairs. So if we're generous and say 50% of the Republican Party is completely on board with at least a completely isolationist, like it's just completely not our business, as well as whoever else they can get from different like Russophilic narratives that have gone around, or Russia sympathetic narratives that have gone around, etc. He'll have those people. Those people will like him, but those people are going to vote for him and vote for his party no matter what. Maybe they'll get more donations from them, but there'll at least be those people to defend him. But what about the rest of the Republican Party, like Brian Fitzpatrick, and those who are in Ukraine right now on little PR missions? I don't know if you guys saw this, but there was this Republican congressman signing shells on the front line before having those shells fired at Russian positions with their signature, with Donald Trump's tagline slogan, "Peace through strength," hashtagged on there, as to get the point across. So there are Republicans that are still supportive of Ukraine. You're not going to win those people over. Centrists, they're not going to take this well either. And of course, the left is the left. They're widely supportive of Ukraine. This will be seen as a failure of Trump to attain his ceasefire, as well as a failure of Trump to support an American ally. And the worse the situation gets, it's going to be headlines that run against him. This will be his first major foreign policy disaster. I mean, one in a traditional presidency might say that even floating the idea of what he floated about Gaza would be a foreign policy disaster to mark blackly somebody's presidency, or any other number of instances like that. But this is the one that's going to have the most bodies attached to it. This is the one that's going to have the most ratifications for European, Ukrainian, and American security interests. This is the one that's going to have the most damage attached to it.
Has donated $20. Only people Trump wants to sanction are ICC who put a warrant on Putin.
That's true. That's true. Thank you for the $20. Even though it seems that those sanctions he wants to put on them is under the auspices of, how dare the ICC expect the United States to be guided by ICC guidelines or investigations, etc. I believe we should have submitted ourselves to the ICC a long time ago. So if Trump takes the pathway of just wiping his hand of the situation, it'll mean before the war's over, before he gets inaugurated, he'll end the war promise was violated. 24 hours was violated. 100 days was violated. And then the promise he made for what he would do if all of this failed was violated. As well as people still being able to turn on the television screens, see the prolonging of the war, and who will they hold accountable? Trump can't keep saying, oh, it's Biden's war, it's Biden's war, it's Biden's war, and not expect him wiping his hands of the situation, leading people to say, oh, that's Trump's ceasefire, Trump ceasefire, Trump ceasefire, anytime Babushka's house catches fire. So I think it would serve the Trump administration, at least when it comes to the perceptions of the American public, in order to find some other solution besides wiping their hands of the situation. So what else could they do now that everybody is acknowledging that this has been a colossal failure? Well, there's a scenario where Donald Trump takes a victory. And I think, honestly, this is the best thing Donald Trump could do for his personal political career, for the Republican Party. Maybe I think there's a better arrangement that could be derived for, national security or Ukraine. But when it comes for Trump fulfilling his promises and looking like he's picking up victories, as well as being able to still keep the favor of those within the party that, care about Europe's defense, taking up Ukraine on that offer for $15 billion in order to buy 10 Patriot air defense systems as a signal of, okay, if the negotiations fail, then we will be Ukraine's arm dealer, not their charity case, but their arms dealer, as Ukraine is trying to serve up that easy victory to the Trump administration right now. That's something he can take them up on. And then at the end of this, you know what Trump can say? Well, some might say that the cutting off of aid was uncouth, or the cutting off of the intelligence support, or dragging this all out was all very uncouth. But it increased our leverage and we got a better deal. And I fought for the American people, etc., etc., etc. And on top of that, he's already found a memorandum of understanding with the Ukrainians on moving forward on the investment fund, which is an extension of the mineral deal that we've heard so much about. So Trump could essentially take the W. Now, could he reinforce this W with aid packages as well in order to help increase Ukraine's leverage? Of course. Could he assist this further by maybe investing or trying to get American companies to invest in Ukraine's arm manufacturing sector and doubling down on sanctions and really actually pulling the trigger on secondary sanctions that he talks so much about? Yes, he could, but I'm also not going to get ahead of myself. We're still dealing with Donald Trump, and I'm just talking about, one of the possible pathways. And I don't think he's exactly going to be eager with his enforcement of the war effort against Russia. Just like I don't think he's going to be exactly eager when it comes to enforcement of sanctions, which means, to me at least, that it's not even so much about Donald Trump doubling down on future sanctions. A lot of it will probably have to do with just enforcing the sanctions that are on the book right now. Because even if he doesn't formally remove the sanctions, a lack of enforcement can have just as much of a disastrous consequence. And that takes us to the other pathway, the scarier pathway, which is the Trump administration takes the Witkoff plan. Now, I think that this, just due to how much of a disaster I think it would be for America's image, for Trump's image, for how uneducated they would come off, how it's not, I don't even think it's approaching America's foreign policy interests, but in pursuit of grandeur, say, in pursuit of a Nobel Peace Prize that will never come, to make Trump look like the diplomatic genius no one knows him to be, he listens to Steve Witkoff, who is Trump's special envoy for the Middle East and his top negotiator on Russia-Ukraine. Now, I say that I think this is not necessarily the most likely scenario due to America's interests and other players at the table, but we do need to remember that it's at least credible enough because he is, again, our top negotiator on the issue. Now, this man has suggested that the quickest way to end the war, and he put this proposal forward to the Trump administration, is to get the Ukrainians to concede 4 regions. Now, to be clear, it's actually 5 regions, but 4 more regions where the Russians don't have complete control. Those regions being Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. That means the little bit of Luhansk that is still unoccupied, like Subraninsky Forest, where we filmed in with that BMP crew, that would be given up. Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, Konstantinivka, Dobropila, Pokrovsk, all these places would be given up in Donetsk. Zaporizhia, a city of 700,000, would be given up. And the city of Kherson, where the human safari is ongoing and where the Ukrainians liberated the only regional capital that the Russians captured for the entirety of the war. That would be given back to them. That only regional capital would be given back to Russian occupation. So the place where the Russians are hunting on the streets with drones, you would give the hunted directly to the hunter. This is what Steve Witkoff says would be the fastest way to end the war. Now, there's probably some other things that are attached to this. Maybe, for example, Russia's continued demand for demilitarization. Again, a non-starter for the Ukrainians, or a number of other demands. But let's just stick here so we don't get lost in the weeds and just say that is a non-starter. Just like demilitarization is a non-starter. A lot of these are non-starters because for as much as J.D. Vance or others might want to stub their nose at the Ukrainians and look down upon them, the Ukrainians are still the ones that are primarily trying to determine their own destiny. And that means the destiny for the peoples and the cities and those that they control. And asking them to give back the city of Kherson and Zaporizhia is not only unintelligent due to the strategic implications of giving the Russians a river crossing.
TRMP in the USA, we just don't need you anymore and you will never get that 21st state. Enjoy the Chinese eating on your own.
Thank you for the $5. Is not only unintelligent due to giving the Russians a river crossing over Ukraine's largest and strongest natural defense given to it by its geography, which, is not a gift from God you'd want to exactly just reject away or just brush away as nothing. But it would also mean giving up the cities that Ukraine has liberated, the cities that they've defended, the cities that many people are on the front line right now trying to defend, including where the Russians have committed some pretty horrific atrocities. A non-starter in the eyes of the Rada, which is the body that would have to recognize any concession. Not to even talk about the rest of the defensive positions that would be given up, and the fact that there's still no guarantee that the Russians couldn't just reignite the war and then use the new river crossing to make a march towards Mykolaiv and then the nation's capital from 2 or 3 directions, from the north, now from the south, and of course, the east. This is a stupid, and I would say silly plan if it was not something that was actually offered to the President of the United States by Steve Witkoff, and we have the reports to prove it. Now, that doesn't mean that Steve Witkoff says this is the only way, we have to do this, that he's crusading for this particular plan. But it does mean that it is an option that Donald Trump should be aware is on the table. And if he so believes that this is his way towards a Nobel Peace Prize or fulfilling his quite ridiculous promise to end the war in 24 hours, then I would not say it is an impossibility. It is a ridiculous plan. It is a plan that's not going to have success. The Ukrainians will reject it, but that's not important. What's important is whether or not Trump would think that is a plan he should pursue, because if he pulls the trigger on it, whether he intended to or not, he could end up extending the war because the Ukrainians won't accept it. And when they don't accept it, and Trump pulls support in response to that, then it's a way of wiping his hands of the conflict once again. And in this pathway, using this avenue, it would also give Trump at least a personal justification to maybe remove sanctions on the Russians, which could see American CNC machines and American machine goods, American drone components, electronic components, and anything necessary to hypercharge the Russian war effort, to get them firing more shells at Ukrainian positions, flying more drones into Ukraine, and dropping more bombs on Ukrainian cities. I'm not trying to scare you guys with doomsday scenarios. I'm just trying to say that There's a lot of pathways from where we can go from this failure. And while some would take the logical conclusion of it looks like just endlessly conceding did not work, the Russians rejected all your deals and sometimes even accepted them in private, but then rejected them in public, humiliating you. It's time to use the other tools in the tool belt. Donald Trump is not a traditional diplomatic figure. Donald Trump is not a traditional politician. Donald Trump's interests here are not always particularly clear. And Donald Trump is not a reliable ally of the Ukrainians. Another God fucking, yeah, no, here it is. Let me read. I can just read it to you. U.S. open to recognizing Crimea as Russian in Ukraine deal. The U.S. preparing to recognize Russian control of the Ukrainian region of Crimea as part of a broader peace agreement between Moscow and Kiev, according to people familiar with the matter. The potential concession is the latest signal that President Donald Trump is eager to cement a ceasefire deal and comes as he and the Secretary of State Marco Rubio suggested on Friday that the administration is approved to move on from its peace brokering efforts unless progress is made quickly. Okay, but so they concede on Crimea, then what? What will that do? So no NATO membership, no U.S. troops in Ukraine. Ukraine was not the one at the negotiating table. We give all this frill and prop and circumstance for the Russians on these high-level diplomatic meetings. We have these normalization meetings with the Russians. We talked to them about lifting sanctions on the agricultural economy, facilitating the return there. We don't place a single tariff on them. We place them on the Ukrainians. All the cuts to the Ukrainians, all the pressure on the Ukrainians, all the PR against the Ukrainians. And it's failed, it's failed, it's failed. There seems to be this universal acknowledgement that somehow this strategy has failed. What do we do now? I got an idea. Concede. Concede again. If you fail, try again the same exact way. My gosh. And look, there's a part of me is like, okay, well, maybe if he announces a recognition in exchange for Russia pulling back from X, Y, and Z, but am I supposed to delude myself? I'm not going to delude myself. It's going to be, we conceded Crimea, and now Russia has increased its negotiating position and has made clear, so we can trade land. Okay, well, now we've started with Crimea. Let's move on to the next ones. Now that has opened negotiations, now we can negotiate Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Again, we're still negotiating a start to the negotiations. And we've conceded NATO, which was supposed to be one of the big sticking points of the war, and Pete Hegseth just let it fumble out of his mouth while visiting Europe. We've conceded troop deployments. We've conceded diplomatic structure. We've conceded high-level diplomatic visits. We've conceded processes starting on normalization. And now we're getting ready to concede territory, all before negotiations have started. Excuse me, but what leverage are we trying to enter negotiations with? You know, when you go to play poker at the poker table, you need to have a card to play, at least to get, like, I think they'll just turn you away from the table if you sit down and you don't pick up you gotta have something. So what are we going to give up when we get to the negotiating table? What's going to still be on the table to give up? This is how you continuously weaken your negotiating position. At some point, you have to pull the trigger on some sort of consequence, or they're going to take you for everything you have. Oh, gosh. Crimea. Boy, oh boy, oh boy.